And I flew to Colombo, Sri Lanka from Hong Kong, and it was a 7-hour flight. And I had a briefcase full of Hallmark ornaments and put my suit and tie on and started walking down Main Street. And I went into the banks and I asked to talk to the commercial lending people. And I asked them one question, which was, do you have any clients that have injection molding machines? And the second bank said yes. And I said, well, can you get me an appointment with those guys? And that afternoon, I sat down with them. It was two guys, and they had about 10 different companies. I toured the factory, which was not great. By the end of that meeting, they were all in. And now, so you fast forward 4 decades, and they're one of our largest ornament suppliers, and it's third generation.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun about all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi, I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to the Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today's episode is brought to you by Palacio and Partners, providing turnkey podcast creation, hosting, production, promotion, and related creative resources for you and your business. Today, Jeff is interviewing Dan Krouse. Dan is a fractional supply chain executive and the founder and principal consultant at Supply Chain Analytics, which he founded in 2017 after a successful career in supply chain, global procurement, and operations at Hallmark Cards. Dan oversaw the Far East division of Hallmark as managing director, leading the charge to expand product development, engineering, sourcing, and partner relationships to cost-effectively differentiate Hallmark's products and quality in the marketplace. He returned to North America as Hallmark's Vice President of Global Procurement. He was later promoted to Operations Vice President of Logistics Solutions. Dan has an MBA in Operations Management from Indiana University and a BS from Purdue University. He is a highly sought-after speaker, a quoted expert in multiple publications, and a past participant in numerous industry and volunteer groups. Let's listen as Jeff talks to Dan.
Dan, welcome to the Corporate Couch this morning.
Good to be here. Oh, there's the dog barking.
Oh, I love it. That's all good. What's the dog's name?
Eddie.
Eddie. Oh,
Eddie.
I love that. Eddie.
Yeah.
Eddie. Is that the dog that I went to a 120 bottle party you had about 10 days ago? 120 bottles of bourbon, mostly bourbon. There was some tequila and some mezcal.
Yep.
And I saw the hunting dog awards or something like that on your basement.
The ribbons.
Is Eddie the award-winning dog?
Yeah, he's not quite as stellar as his old man, who's now gone, but he's not bad. So that's again one of my my side hobbies over the last 10 years is breeding Labradors. So
I'm excited to talk to you. We're going to talk about a lot of things. Working for a multi-billion-dollar company. We're going to talk about leadership development, tariffs, supply chain, procurement, how to monetize all your meetings at Pilgrim Coffee, and talk about your annual party. But since we're recording here, why the hell you would book a meeting, a podcast interview on December 31st of 2025, I don't know, but I'm excited to talk to you and end the year.
Yeah.
Talking with you, Dan. But let's talk about some fun questions first. How about, since it is New Year's Eve, or will be soon here in about, 10 hours, give or take. What's the craziest New Year's Eve party you've ever been to?
Probably one when I lived in Hong Kong. You got a twofer over there because you got the regular New Year's Eve and then you got Chinese New Year. So you got two of them while you were there. So those were those were pretty spectacular. And the big handover party in 1997, where they turned it over to China.
Oh, wow.
That was a week-long festivity. Not a lot of work got done that week.
Yeah. Was there any nudity at either of those parties?
No,
Okay.
not that I can recall.
Okay. Well, nothing I want to delve into then. We're going to be loosey-goosey here on the last interview of 2025. So how about you're pretty out there, socially. You've become popular on LinkedIn, talking about tariffs. And even though people know you fairly well, Dan, what would surprise them about you?
Well, I think a little bit of history, having lived overseas for 12 years, 3 of my 4 kids were born over there. I had to drag my wife out of there twice. She wasn't, wildly enthusiastic about moving back to Kansas City. But, when you work for a big mothership, at some point you got to come home and kind of reestablish yourself. So it's like, honey, we got to go back. And she always referred to it as being in a sorority, only you had money. So why would I want to go back?
I love that.
Yeah. So
where'd you grow up, and what was fun for you growing up?
I grew up in Indiana, and not a big town, Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the northeast corner of the state. And my mother was a homemaker. My dad was an accountant, and he was 3rd or 4th generation German immigrant, and grew up out in the country and eventually became an accountant. And we had a strong Catholic upbringing, grade school, high schools. Some of my older siblings, we had a pretty big spread. We had about 15 years between the oldest and the youngest, and all kinds of schools in between with that spread. And and when I was growing up, my folks got a place out in the country, and that probably helped fuel my interest in spending time outdoors and dogs and hunting and doing things with my boys and those types of interests. And a lot of people don't know, but my undergraduate degree is in forestry. So at one point I thought I wanted to have an outdoor career. And
interesting.
That changed pretty dramatically, obviously.
Yeah, I didn't actually. I was going to ask you, because you went to Purdue, and we'll talk about that later, but it didn't have a major. It just said you had a Bachelor of Science. So forestry, nice.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Fort Wayne. One of the original NBA franchises, right, was the Fort Wayne team?
Fort Wayne Pistons, I think NBA champions in 1956.
Yeah, there you go. So
or they moved to Detroit.
You didn't mention basketball was a love growing up. I thought in Indiana you had to play basketball. I was more of a football guy. I was terrible at basketball, so would follow some of the followed Indiana basketball, and later on I went to Indiana for grad school, and Bobby Knight was still coaching then, and the football team then was horrible, and It was just terrible, and now it's come full circle. So. Yeah, I forget the coach's name. He is Italian, but he's done a fantastic job. And then Mendoza won the Heisman this year, so that's all good.
It's amazing. It really is.
Yeah.
Small town in Indiana, and I met my future wife while I was at Purdue, and she was in a physical therapy program at Indiana. She asked me the question. She goes, "Hey, how much does a staff forester make at International Paper?" And I was like, $9,000 or something. She's like, "Have you ever thought about a different career?" And living out in the woods in Mississippi didn't sound like a really great thing to her either. So anyway, so I ended up going straight through to grad school in Indiana. That's when Hallmark hired me out of grad school into their management development program.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you if you went straight through. So you graduated from Purdue.
Yep.
And then they said, your future wife, which you obviously thought would be your future wife, or at least had some inkling that it would be a longer term relationship than just the frat parties in college, said you need to get another job. So, I mean, you went to, Kelly School of Business, right?
It wasn't Kelly then, but it was Indiana.
Right.
It didn't have that official name yet, but
Oh, right,
yeah,
right. Yeah, before it became in vogue,
yeah,
to have
yeah.
cool names.
And
So how?
this was when
Yeah.
Hallmark still had the management development program. So
Yeah, so talk about that. I loved hearing the stories because it was, you're 22, 23, whatever, how many years it took you to graduate from college. And it's just a harrowing experience to get that first job, right? Unless you got, your parents knew somebody, your uncle, and you got a
yeah.
job somewhere, or your aunt got your job somewhere. But
Well, and
I always like, how'd you get the first job out of
well, and
college?
I was fortunate because there were a lot of companies that were recruiting out of IU's MBA program. Hallmark was one that I could kind of connect to, understood the company and what they did, and the other alternatives were Kimberly Clark. There was a couple of medical device companies, Cummins Diesel Engine, which is a big company back in Indiana. So there was a lot of really top notch companies that were recruiting out of there. But the opportunity at Hallmark with the management development program appealed to me because the company had a strong reputation, strong culture, could get my head around, what the business was. Going into a management development program where you could kind of test drive in 3 month increments various parts of the business, and hopefully after 12 to 18 months somebody wanted you, which was the name of the game. And
Right.
they'd hire, a dozen people into that program every year, and you would, some people had a marketing track or a sales track or a product development track or a creative track. I was clearly in an operations track, and nobody even called it supply chain back then.
Right.
That was, operations, and within operations there was materials management. Within materials management there was purchasing. So
Right.
it was a stair step structure, kind of like that. So
And I know Hallmark's been around forever. Did they start in business like in the 1920s? I can't remember exactly the time.
yeah, very early in the 20th century. J.C. Hall moved
Yeah.
to Kansas City and set up shop in the YMCA downtown with a shoebox full of note cards, and that's how the company started. So
Yeah. Yeah. So it's iconic Kansas City company, and really, still obviously it's a iconic, company overall, right, in the
mhm.
U.S. So talk about that. I mean, obviously, nothing else. Your first job is in a, huge company,
Yeah,
privately held, obviously. But talk about, because I think early on you get the opportunity to go to Hong Kong.
yeah.
Is
Well,
that
it was kind of, I refer to it as the conversation that kind of changed everything. I was there 2 weeks, and my first assignment was in purchasing, and it's like, oh, okay, you buy stuff, you get a good price, you get it here on time. I can get my head around this. It seems
right?
fairly, straightforward, and I enjoyed that from my earliest time with the company. So coincidentally, it was my first assignment, and I was sitting with the head of that division at the time, and he said, "Hey, have you ever thought about living and working overseas?" And I had never thought about that, and he said, "Well, you might want to think about it if you're interested in purchasing. We've got an operation over there where we do product development. We buy things and we ship it back to the States." And he said, I actually was one of the first people that went over there, which was probably gosh, dating myself, probably in the late 60s, early 70s when he went over for a few years. And that was
Right.
generationally earlier than I was over there. And so that kind of was the triggering event for me in terms of that sounds like a really interesting career path, especially if you like working with outside suppliers. Working with the inside folks was great because it was creative, it was product development. You would be the translating arm between those groups and what was happening overseas. And then, if you were physically over there, you were on the front line day in and day out with get it done and get stuff on the water. So I thought about it more. I took probably two or three more management development assignments, and the person that I was working for when I was in the department was moving to greeting cards And I got the call and they said, hey, we'd like you to take this buying job, but don't take it unless you're willing to go overseas if we ask you. It was like, great. But in the back of my mind, it was like, they're never going to ask me to go. So I took the job, and 10 months later, DEFCON 1, we need you to go, and you got a day to decide. For your listening audience that's old enough, you kind of remember where you were on 9/11 or where you were when Kennedy was shot. And I called up my wife and I said, well, we got a decision to make. So I remember where we went, what we ate. At the end of that dinner, we were moving. I didn't even have a passport. I'd never been overseas before. I'd never been out of the country before. It was a leap of faith.
Yeah, really. I mean, and because that's early days. Probably of working in the Far East and
oh yeah, and, China was not even open yet. We had terrific suppliers in Hong Kong, but the labor market was beginning to dry up. So there were categories of products that we were sourcing over there. A major one was Christmas ornaments. Schedules were getting later and later, and it's like part of my job was to, once I got there, was to go to these countries in the Far East and try to find suppliers to make Christmas ornaments. And there was no playbook. There was no internet. The usual suspects would be the Rotary and Chamber of Commerce, but there was really no playbook in terms of how to do that.
Yeah, I think it was early 70s. Like Nixon went over there and Henry Kissinger to open it up. Really,
yeah. And there were some Hong Kong guys that were groundbreakers that went back and set up toy companies and that type of thing. Some of our suppliers were like, but I don't want to go back because I escaped that government in that country for a reason. I don't want to go back. And it's like, well, you've got two choices. You can go back or you can retire, because the business is probably going to decline in terms of what we give you. And so that was part of what I did in the 80s. In addition to, get product developed and get it on the water. And another part of our business in the 80s was we did premiums for fast food companies. So if you go to Burger King and get a Happy Meal, there was stuff that we contracted with them to physically make and then would ship it back to the United States. And that probably peaked around 1987. I'm guessing that was a rough summer. We had to get about 40 million units out for the fast food companies. And I was probably on my fourth year at that point being over there.
Yeah.
But yeah, the 80s was just like the Wild West. It was a lot of fun. And I had the opportunity to have, real general management experience at a very young age. I mean, everybody we knew that worked for American companies was 10 to 15 years older than me.
Well, talk about some. I remember the first time we had coffee. God, it's been 3 or 4 years ago, but I remember some crazy story that you had. You were the first person at Hallmark to go over to Hong Kong. Like whatever you said, 10, 15 years. And you were leasing some, 10, 15,000 square foot warehouse, but you're only using like 1,000 square feet. But talk about some crazy stories because nobody from corporate headquarters in Kansas City had been over.
Well, at that point, I was probably fifth generation in terms of going over there. So there were other people that predated me. But I was kind of on the forefront of what was happening with China opening up and a variety of other things. And like I said, there really wasn't much playbook in terms of how to do some of these things. And, I had a guy come up to me a few years ago and he said, he introduced himself and he worked for Hallmark, et cetera. And he goes, there's this urban legend about you. And I'm like, oh boy, I wonder what that is. And he said, is it true you found our Sri Lankan supplier in the phone book? Now, for some of your listeners, they're going to say, what's a phone book?
Right.
And I said, no, it was not in the phone book, but I've heard that story. And, and I flew to Colombo, Sri Lanka from Hong Kong, and it was a 7-hour flight, and I had a briefcase full of Hallmark ornaments and put my suit and tie on and started walking down Main Street. And I went into the banks and I asked to talk to the commercial lending people. And I asked them one question, which was, do you have any clients that have injection molding machines? And the second bank said yes. And I said, well, can you get me an appointment with those guys? And that afternoon, I sat down with them. It was two guys, and they had about 10 different companies. I toured the factory, which was not great. And, by the end of that meeting, they were all in. And now, so you fast forward 4 decades, and they're one of our largest ornament suppliers in its third generation.
Talk about, obviously because of your MBA at Indiana, you're recruited, you're in a small cohort of 12 people, probably, similar background, Duke,
Mm-hmm.
Wharton, all these, high-end business schools. But, you're thrown into, at a young age, so you're 25, 26, 27-ish, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And did you have any leadership mentors? Like, how did you learn to lead people that were so much older than you? And, a lot of 25-year-olds would be, scared to death.
Yeah.
Probably that would
Well,
include
it was
myself.
a baptism by fire. I can, remember I had good mentors before I went overseas, and some of it was the people that had been over there already that predated me. I can remember some of the conversations that they'd have with me, which, were formative for me, which is, perception is reality. You may not agree with this, but here's the perception. So, ignore this at your own risk, from a leadership perspective, and those types of things were formative. And then once I got over there were either suppliers or other employees over there that I learned a lot from. One of the most important messages I got from somebody when I got over there was, man, talk about servant leader. You got to get in the trenches with these people or they will not respect you. You're going to have to put in long hours. You're going to have to travel a lot. You're going to have to help them solve problems. And so that was a huge issue. And then the other one was, you literally had to be in the factories all the time to really know what was going on. So, after being over there for 12 years, I was probably in China, I don't know, 700 times. I was in there all the time. And so very, very important, kind of boots on the ground type of coaching and mentorship that I got from people. And the other one was, you're in a foreign country, you're there at the on behalf of the organization you're working for, and you're there to make decisions. You got a 13-hour time difference, and I remember getting on these phone calls late at night with the folks back in Kansas City, and occasionally it would get testy, and I'd have to kind of remind them, I'm here and you're not. And
Right. Right.
if you guys want to armchair quarterback this thing all day long, you don't need me. But the other mentors were some Chinese suppliers and other suppliers that I met that I formed strong relationships with over a number of years. Folks were relationship focused. They certainly weren't transactional. They wanted to have strong relationships with people that they worked with. Learning some of those lessons were very formative as well. So, after being over there for 5 years, it was time to go back on tour one. Came back to Kansas City, and like a lot of companies, it was, hey, when you leave, the clock stops, and when you come back, it starts again. And Hallmark had some of those, certainly those issues with folks that went over and did the overseas assignments. And the other challenge that you had was there was only a subset of people that worked for the company that really understood the depth and breadth of those jobs, which made it sometimes even more challenging when you came back. And you had to kind of get your head screwed on straight where, hey, you're over there and you're the big fish in the little pond, and you get back and you're going to have to work hard to reestablish yourself. And
Right.
so I came back, and I was back for 3 years, product development, marketing related job, something totally outside of operations. And then I got a call from a guy that was in Hong Kong, and he said, well, we'd like to offer you the job of managing director to come back. and I wasn't lobbying to go back. Had a great experience. Wasn't really sure that was the career path I was going to be on. And I can remember getting off the phone and going downstairs, and my wife's got a newborn in her lap. And I said, "Well, you won't believe the call I just got." 5 minutes later, we were moving back. She's like, "I'm totally in. Let's go back."
Wow.
So that,
And
and
was that
you can't,
newborn was that newborn your child or
yeah,
someone
you
else's?
can't put you can't put a price tag on a supportive family with these types of things, because it's the whole package. I always
Yeah.
used to tell people, we have high expectations of you professionally when I would send people over there, but we have high hopes for you personally, because we want you to get a lot out of this beyond just the job.
Hmm.
It's a growth experience. If you're married, your marriage is probably going to be stronger. But it's a situation where both parties, the husband and the spouse, had to be all in, and
Yeah.
sometimes it
Oh
was,
yeah.
and that was usually the one of the red flags. I mean, for years, Hallmark would run you through um, uh, a psychological profiling where you spent 5 days with someone with personal interviews and everything else. And he was a professor out of William Jewell, and standardized tests and IQ tests and all kinds of stuff. At the end of the week, he would write up a 20-page single spaced write up on everything you ever wanted to know about Dan Krouse, because it was expensive to move people over there and bring them back. Years later, when they stopped doing that, they'd call me up and say, "Hey, we got a live one. Can you take them to dinner and give us a read?" And after dinner, I just turned to my wife, and she'd either go thumbs up or thumbs down. And if it was thumbs down, it was usually because one of the trailing spouse was not all in on this. That's a formula for disaster. That's not a good program to be on over there.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because I mean, obviously your wife was all in, because that's I was going to ask the question, because it's like the first time you went over, you're probably early in your marriage,
Hmm.
and
Couple
you're
of years.
fine because yeah,
Couple of years.
I mean you're fine because you're working,
Yeah.
and you have people that you're going to know
Well, and
from work.
they're trying to set a household up in a foreign
Yeah, and they
country
know
where
no one.
there's a
They're in a foreign
there's a
country,
language issue. Okay.
right?
So, and you're totally engaged with what you're trying to do with your job. They're trying to set a household up. Then when you come back, it flips, because you're back in the big company. It's an adjustment problem. It took me a couple of years to feel good about starting the car every morning. She's engaged with back in the States with the kids in the house and everything. So she doesn't have the trailing spouse issue coming in the other direction. And, and by the time you get through the feeling good about starting the car every morning, it's almost like general apathy has set in. It's like, why did I
Yeah,
come back, and I should have stayed, or, all kinds of thoughts go through your mind. But
yeah,
the key, I think, for many of us was, you don't want to stay over there indefinitely, but you really need to have a job to come back to that you're excited about. You don't want to come
right.
back to special assignment or special projects or something like that. Of course, when you have kids and stuff, you try to hit the timing for the school years, and there's a variety of things that go into a relocation of that magnitude. It sure helps to have a supportive family.
Yeah,
And I know my wife's family kind of was like, "Well, I guess we'll see him once a year." And my family was like, "Oh, heck no, we're going to travel over there while you're there." So
yeah,
that's also helpful. But you make lifelong friends. I mean,
sure.
some of our best friends are people we met at the Hilton Hotel in the 80s when we were there looking for an apartment. My son just got married last month, and a couple that we met at the pool at the Hilton Hotel was at that wedding. It's amazing the people you meet, and you're thrown into that environment where people don't have family around, so they make friends. They travel together, they do
Yeah,
things together,
yeah,
and you meet very, very interesting people. And I always felt blessed because if you've got big companies that are sending employees over there, these are pretty sharp people. You not only can become good friends with them, but you can learn a lot from them, especially given what industry they're in and what they happen to be doing. So that was always a good aspect of it as well.
Dan, I'm so intrigued. So, I had a similar, not similar experience, but I had same experience in terms of working for a large company in Kansas City, Sprint, and
Mm-hmm.
prior to that, AT&T, when AT&T was the biggest company in the world when I started. But I'm very curious because you have a great personality, you have your own leadership style, but this is a compliment when I say this. You climb the corporate ranks. You're a corporate officer. You're in the big meetings with Irv Hockaday, the CEO of at the time at Hallmark, and the Hall family member, and all this. But you're not your typical, let's say, corporate ladder climber. You're going to say what you think. So I'm just curious, when were you always like that? Did you have the kind of I'll say confidence to be yourself, tell people the truth, or did you learn that from somebody? And I would love to hear some great stories and board meetings or whatever where you had to be Dan and everybody else was towing the corporate line.
Are you drowning in boring corporate communications? Palacio and Partners is here to rescue you. We transform internal podcasts from snooze fest to must-listen content that actually connects your team and strengthens your culture. Imagine podcast episodes that make your employees laugh while staying informed. Our founder, Jeff Palacio, doesn't just create podcasts, he creates conversations that break through the noise. Whether you're a growing startup or a massive corporation, we turn your company's story into audio gold. Leadership becomes human. Remote teams feel connected. Your message cuts through the clutter. Palacio and Partners, where corporate communications gets a fun makeover. Let's make your podcast work harder than your email inbox ever could. Jeff is happy to share his insights on podcasting with you. You can contact him via LinkedIn or schedule a Zoom call via the link in the episode description.
Would love to hear some great stories and board meetings or whatever where you had to be Dan and everybody else was towing the corporate line.
Well, I think a lot of that came from being over there and having those conference rooms full of people back in the States. And it's like, hey guys, it's 11 o'clock at night. I'm trying to go to bed.
Right.
I'm going to tell you what's really going on, and you're going to have to deal with certain things on your end. I'm going to deal with things on my end, and that's it. It is such a fast-paced entrepreneurial environment over there. Everything moves at lightning speed, so you've got to keep up. You got to get stuff done, and that also involves kind of being direct and straight to the point with folks. I guess I probably brought a lot of that back with me after that experience because, your patience isn't 20 miles long. And, I remember when I retired from Hallmark, I was having a meeting with a senior executive, and he paid me one of the best compliments ever. He goes, Krouse, the one thing I'll say about you is I never heard the dog ate my homework come out of your mouth. So that might give you an idea what his day was like.
Right.
But yeah, I think I probably got quite a bit of that, Jeff, from being over there in an environment where you had to be direct and to the point, and not in a hurtful way. But there were some moments back in Kansas City where I was trying to get the point across, and in a big meeting with some folks, and immediately went back to my office and started putting stuff in boxes because I figured, okay, I think I went a little bit too far on that one. But I lived for another day.
If you were in junior high or high school, I would say how many times you go to the principal's office for your behavior. But I'll say for your Hallmark experience, how many times did you have to go to the HR chief people officer have conversations with him or her?
Fortunately, not many. Fortunately, not many. So yeah. I was lucky in that regard. But the other thing is that it doesn't matter, whether you've been with the company 3 months or 30 years. you have to be open to the feedback. And
Yeah.
the worst thing you can do is get defensive or try to rationalize something that happened. It's like, hey, if this is a perception, I've got to deal with it, and I've got to do something about this. Trying to take that through the finish line, even when you retire. That's just an important trait that I think everybody should learn early in their career, is to accept it at face value, assume positive intent in terms of how it's delivered. We're not making this personal, but here's something you had to do. And I had hard charging people that worked for me. And, on one hand, it'd be like, okay, I got it. And off they'd go. And then somebody else might call you 3 times on the way home, trying to talk you out of the feedback you just gave them.
Right.
And it's like, that's not how this
Yeah.
works.
Yeah. Dan, Hallmark is known as a company that really focuses on leadership development. They do a lot of programs, and both internally and with external business partners. But what was your experience with their leadership development programs, and how did that kind of influence your philosophy on
Well,
leadership
there
development?
was a number over over a 30-year period, that I was there, various programs of various types, and they typically started with, some sort of assessment feedback process. They would send people to Center for Creative Leadership, which is still around. They had outside groups come in and do engagement surveys and then feedback loops, and a variety of other things to try to impress upon folks areas of change and engagement. The thing that I found very helpful was sending folks out, and I did quite a bit of this, out to outside conferences and those types of things where you would interact with other leaders rather than come back and put the binder on the shelf and never open it again. We've all had those over our careers. It's like, okay, what did you come up with a new colleague, somebody that you can talk to periodically that might be in a similar space with another company? Are there opportunities for you to engage with them on change related activity? And what things are you going to take from that experience and try to bring back into the business, whether it was a leadership issue or something relative to your job? And I always found those to be very helpful. So, when I would send people out, it's like, you got to come back with something other than the binder. So just so you know, and
Right. Right.
that's going to be an expectation. And they enjoyed it, because a lot of times big companies have a tendency to be the center of the universe. It's stuff coming in, but we can't learn anything from anyone else, and that's just a big problem for a lot of big companies. So if you've got executives that are thinking out 2 to 3 years, that can be very beneficial for what you're doing strategically for the business. And I always tried to
Yeah.
tell people, hey, if you progress through the organization, you're going to have to spend more and more time on that 2 to 3 year space, and not, the day in and day out firefighting. And a
Right.
lot of people thought that was the job,
Yeah.
was firefighting.
Yeah.
And, as you can appreciate, there's a big difference between firefighting and problem solving.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
people conflate those all the time. So,
So talk about, I mean, you're, one of the largest, you're a corporate officer of one of the largest privately held companies in the country at the time. Kind of, what was your reason for leaving the mothership, leaving Hallmark?
it was time. I was 35 plus years, and gosh, the last role I was in, I'd been in for about 10 years, and I didn't feel like there was many more hills to climb. So it was time. And the next generation was clearly ready, and I probably spent the last 10 years of my career as much on the coaching and mentoring side as I did with what the job was. And so I was stood up the global procurement group, and then I went into distribution and warehousing, fulfillment, logistics, and did that for about 10 years. And we had a pretty big footprint that consolidated over about the 10-year period. And there was like, I'm thinking to myself, what's the next dollar that I can save Hallmark? And at some point you're out of gas, but more importantly, the next generation was ready.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure what the next chapter was going to look like.
Yeah, so I'm very interested now. We're in the same age demographic, and I had a kind of a different experience. Like my nature is being a loyalist in terms of friends and people I work with, or same person has cut my hair since I moved to Kansas City in 1982. But talk about how your process of reinventing yourself and what you went through after being at this great company with unbelievable experiences, and you were high levels that influence the direction of the company. Like, talk about post Hallmark and your process and your psyche going through all that
Yeah.
to kind of determine
Well,
what's next.
I think it depends kind of on how you're wired. I grew up in a family where people worked until pretty late in life, tried to stay active and busy and keep your mind going and learn new things. I'm always interested in learning new things. I think the thing that really energized me as I was kind of side in, side out with Hallmark and what's next. And there was a bit of a pause as I started to try to figure that out and meet people like you and other people in Kansas City. It was like, oh my gosh, where have these people been my whole life? I've been head down at a big company. You're exhausted at the end of the day. You go home, there's not many opportunities to network, meet new people, understand other business challenges and things like that. And this whole world opened up to me where it's like, wow, there's all this stuff going on, and maybe I can help some people, based upon my experience. And there was a guy that I worked with initially after taking several months to try to figure it out. And he had done some consulting work for Hallmark, but he was trying to make the leap from consulting to advisory work. And I'm like, what's the difference? Because everybody kind of conflates the two. And he said, well, Dan, an advisor is somebody that's been doing this for 30 years. They know what the answer is in about 2.5 days. They want to write it up, present it, leave, and get paid. They don't want to sit in a conference room for 9 months. Sounds like great work, if you can get it. But I didn't have any consulting experience or anything else. And so, I kind of dove into it, and that was really kind of the genesis of it. It's largely been small to mid market. I'm not trying to do stuff for big companies. Although in the tariff space, I'm getting calls now saying, hey, we've got this client. We wonder if you 1099 in to be on this team and that type of thing. And, one of my things I've always done is answer the phone. You never know where it's going to lead, who you're going to meet, what you're going to learn. That's an important aspect in terms of how I've tried to operate. That was really the kind of the mindset genesis. But the other thing I learned here in Kansas City and the group that I've tried to gravitate to when you talk about networking and people and a variety of folks, I have found that it kind of falls into two distinct buckets. You've got the relationship crowd and you've got the transactional crowd. And I'm to the stage in my life where it's like, I'm all in on the relationship crowd. I want to be around people I like. I want to be around people I can learn something from. I want to be around people that I might be able to help, personally or professionally or even spiritually, which is a great tagline. I love that tagline. I don't know who I heard that from, but I got to steal it. And just in a total kind of pay it forward mindset. I might not be able to help you today, but maybe a year from now, you're looking for somebody to help you with, a supply chain position, and maybe I know somebody, or can you make an introduction here because it looks like maybe you did some work for that company, those types of things. And now, as I meet people, and whether it's at a coffee or something like that, I can tell pretty quickly which group they fall into and whether they're putting a dollar sign on my face.
Right.
It's like, okay, I know what group you're in.
Right.
But
Yeah.
and I've kind of gotten over that because one, I'm not wired that way, but
Yeah.
that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's like, okay, you know who they are and you're
Yeah.
just going to move on. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just kind of how it is. So,
Yeah. I kind of went through this a little bit with after I left United Way, just trying to experience the what's next thing. But what was the hardest part for you after after leaving Hallmark? What was hard for you?
Well, I think you're at the big company and you're used to telling people what to do all day. And once you're leaving, you got to have thick skin because people will, if you're selling or whatever you're trying to do, it's not going to just fall into your lap. You got to keep working it, build those relationships, try to refine what it is you do. And supply chain is very broad, and that's an ongoing process for me. If you've not been in sales, that's a tough deal. And the other key learning for me is, heck, I'd have a 2 hour meeting with a business owner and do a factory tour or a warehouse tour or something. And heck, I'd give them the answer before I got the job. So, like, stop doing that.
Right.
That's great. I got a staff meeting Monday and I'm going to tell them everything you told me.
Right. There you go. There you go.
Yeah. So there's been some learnings, along the way,
Yeah.
and it is not easy for people to make that transition, especially coming out of a big company, and I'm still working on it years later. And when people ask me or talk to me about those kind of transitions, I always tell them the first thing you got to decide is whether or not you're still a job seeker. If you're still a job seeker, then this isn't probably what you want to do. And if you're not a job seeker, you got to be really careful about what you get sucked into. And even if you claim it's part time and you're trying to get some stuff done in Overland Park and you're on the phone all day with a client you're trying to help because there was a fight at the high school yearbook meeting, that's pretty painful, especially when
Right.
you're trying not to do that. I don't want to get into the mode where I'm writing performance reviews and those types of things as a fractional executive. If it's project leadership and those types of things, fine, but you really have to be careful about not letting it become a job if that's not what you want.
With the current administration, obviously tariffs have become big, and you've kind of really been a thought leader in the tariff space and really got active on LinkedIn, I believe, earlier this year. So talk about that process. Obviously, you had the experience being in China and Hong Kong and
Yeah.
dealing with tariffs, probably your most of your career at Hallmark. But
Mhm.
talk through that process for you.
Yeah, I was been through multiple cycles with Hallmark. In the 80s, China hadn't opened up yet. Now everybody talks about diversification being China plus one or China plus three, and heck, we were doing Hong Kong plus five before China even opened up. So, I knew something about supply chain diversification and what it would mean for your business if you did that. In the 90s, China was opening up but was constantly under trade and tariff pressures with the United States because they were not in the WTO. They didn't have most favored nation trade status. So in the 90s, when I was back in Hong Kong, I actually lobbied on behalf of China's trade status in Washington as part of a delegation with the Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. I was on a webinar the other day with a big group and they said, okay, so this is your fault. and but people, most American companies were in the same position, which was, economic reform will bring about political change, and I'll let people decide whether that's gotten better or worse. But now, we kind of refer to China as kind of in the penalty box, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to extract themselves from it. The timing was good for me because I knew something about it. I knew about tariff mitigation strategies. I knew about supply chain diversification, how to look at these things, how to do scenario development, how you get to your baseline landed cost, how you work with a leadership team on here are the different options that you have. And the thing that is just still amazing for me is how reactive companies have been with everything going on with tariffs. And it's like, this is structural. This is not going to go away, especially, if the US Treasury gets a hold of a couple hundred billion a year in tariff revenue. It doesn't matter whether it's a Republican administration or a Democrat administration, they're going to want to hang on to as much of that money as possible. And now everybody's waiting with bated breath as to what the Supreme Court will rule on the IEPA emergency tariffs. And now the the money seems to favor they're going to rule in regard to the plaintiffs, and then everybody's going to line up for, 125 billion dollars in refunds, which they may never see. So while you're chasing that shiny penny, then the question becomes is what are you doing with your supply chain that you ought to really be spending most of your time on? And that's what I'm trying to help companies work through. And they just need a steady hand and somebody that's been down this road before. That's not their first rodeo. And here's how you engage your leadership team, and here's how you do scenario development and those types of things. And you start with a number at the front end, and then you have various scenarios, and you have a number at the back end. And along those pathways, there could be various triggering events that move you from scenario A to B. But if you have a plan, everybody on your leadership team knows what you're going to do if X, Y, and Z happens. But it's been a really crazy year. And you mentioned LinkedIn. If you'd asked me back in March if I'd be publishing this stuff on LinkedIn, that you must be talking about somebody else. It's
Yeah.
so
We'll talk about that a little bit because obviously I did notice the change that you became very active, and even when you would post something on LinkedIn, you would message your friends and colleagues that you think can benefit from your sage advice on tariffs. But what kind of how did you kind of change from being you were on LinkedIn, but you're very active and be a tariff thought leader?
Well, and obviously. Tariffs was a hot topic, and there's various consultants and customs brokers and trade attorneys and people that are out there posting. But the thing that I came to realize with LinkedIn is, it's a lot of wash, rinse, and repeat, where they're posting a Bloomberg article or something and maybe putting a paragraph on it, but real op-eds on here's what's going on and here's why I think this is happening based upon everything that I've looked at is not that common, at the end of the day. So that's really what I tried to do and still try to do, is to come up with an interesting angle to what's going on, why I think it's going on, and here's what the implications are for your business. I've tried to be consistent, throughout that. And, if I hear Trump say something in the Oval Office or Scott Besson or one of the other trade people, I'm trying to think, okay, what are they really saying that they're not saying? That's usually the pathway I go down. And, I've got some influencers and some people that reach out to me. And I hope it's of value because I enjoy doing it, but I also don't want to just do the repeat cycle that other folks are doing. If I'm going to spend time on it, I'd rather have it be unique and hopefully be of some value to folks. So, but yeah, I kind of, given the fact that, I was trying to figure out, okay, what else am I going to market regarding advisory work in the supply chain space? Tariffs couldn't have come at a better time because it's an easy entry point for a lot of organizations. It's like, oh yeah, right. We've got a lot of imports. We're under tariff pressures, and as I mentioned earlier, supply chain is really broad. I mean, that can be, procurement of raw materials to fulfillment on the back end with inventory, warehousing, manufacturing, logistics, transportation, and, when I'm meeting with trusted advisors or referral partners with like yourself that introduce me and I introduce them to various businesses, it's like, Dan, well, I think I kind of get what you do. What should I be listening for with a business owner? And it's like, that can be 2,000 different things. I would say wealth advisors, the M&A guys, the commercial lenders, they're tied to financial issues and margin pressures and those types of things. So they've got a pretty good ear, but they have to feel good enough about me and what I could do for a client in order to make that introduction, because, their reputation and brand is on the line. And sometimes it takes time to nurture those relationships where they can feel good about it.
So we're recording at the end of 2025, literally the last day. But for 2026, what are you going to focus on? Where would you like to be at the end of 2026?
Well, I just so enjoy helping people through tariff mitigation strategies, supply chain strategies, Another area that I'm going to try to spend more time on in the coming year is the coaching and mentoring space. I do that oftentimes as part of my engagement. One of the best compliments I can get from a business owner is, people learned a lot from you and you treated everybody on the floor the same as you did, people in my office. And I really appreciate that kind of compliment. But the leave behind for me is, have I taught them something or educated them on something that, will survive, past Dan. So I'm hoping to lean more into the coaching and mentoring side of supply chain related work. And I'm starting to get some calls where, hey, I've got somebody new in supply chain. We think they're high potential. They probably need some coaching up, and maybe it's somebody outside the organization. Are you open to doing that kind of work with folks? And I love that. You know, and a big part of people development at Hallmark was, when we would do succession planning or other things, it was like, what was the big leave behind? You somebody the other day, I heard him say, you do your current job day in and day out to keep your job, but if you want the next bigger job, you better do something transformational. So, when somebody thought, hey, they're ready for the next job, you'd sit there and say, well, what was your big leave behind? What's the legacy you've left behind? You're doing a great job, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've had the leave behind. And I had a manager at Hallmark that would literally just toss people out of succession planning rooms, where they would put up a photograph and they'd say, oh, great person. And, does a fantastic job, great feedback from the customers and stuff like that. And the guy's like, well, what's the leave behind? If there's not a leave behind, maybe they're not ready for the next job. And you got to kind of push yourself into breaking out into new ground that you maybe haven't been in before, and don't stay in your vertical. Try to take assignments outside of that. And so for 2026, I want to do more of that from a client perspective, where I can help people through that, and maybe it will help supply chain teams become more effective and efficient, those types of things. So looking forward to it. Lots going on in 2026. I can tell kind of how it's shaping up right now, so I'm excited about it.
Yeah, the rapid pace of change is just incredible. That in this day and age, and it brings a lot of opportunities and brings a lot of challenges, but you have to embrace it, because it's not gonna.
No,
It's
it's just
it's going to get faster.
just
So
like the
yeah,
whole AI thing and what it
yeah,
means for supply chain. And I'm trying to stay on top of that with tariffs and AI related tools that can help people. And then what else is happening with data governance and how you manage data and those types of things. And with my work, I know what I need to get out of the system, but AI is going to help tremendously with that, because it's like,
yeah.
I'm not going to start fooling with the wiring when I open up the hood of the car. I know what I need out, whether it's dashboards or, KPIs or whatever it happens to be. And it's kind of a whole new world out there. And I think in a good way, because, not that many years ago, if you had a great idea, software development was very expensive, and now things are becoming a little bit easier. But you also don't want to go into a conference room, and I've had these calls as well. Let's work on the next chapter for tariff monitoring solutions utilizing AI, and it's like, I don't want to go into a half day whiteboard session where everybody's breathing their own exhaust, and then they come out and by Friday, three other companies are doing that exact same thing. So it's like,
Right.
do your own due diligence, but I'm trying to stay on top of it.
Yeah.
And it's not easy. It really isn't.
Well, obviously, you're a lifelong learner, and that's one of the keys to being, I think, a great leader and a great person, and trying to make an impact and leave a legacy. So, Dan, I love helping two groups of people. One's that recent college graduate, or these days even high school graduate, as they begin their professional career journey. What advice do you have for them as they begin that journey, as well as getting that first job?
I think the key is to be open to the art of the possible, what that might look like. And, I think initially, oftentimes it's like, well, I'm not sure that's the right job. It just depends on what doors open up and how you're evaluating that. But once you get that job, keep your eyes and ears open within the organization in terms of where growth and development opportunities might be. What has been the career path of various people in the organization? Now, of course, turnover is much different than it was when you and I were starting out their careers. I mean, nobody rarely works for the same company for 35 years anymore. And now I don't know what it is. It's like 17 different companies now on average.
Right.
What does that look like? And I always try to tell people, don't discount something out of hand, because you might be surprised at how well you like it, how good you are at it. If it doesn't work out, don't be afraid to pivot, and, always answer the phone, because, you never know where that phone call is going to come from and what the opportunity might be to present itself. And, if you're younger, you can do a lot of different jobs. And I did a lot of different jobs at restaurants and janitorial work and everything else. It's all formative, because you figure out, okay, I need to study harder or do other things if I don't want to do that. There's something to be learned from all of those types of opportunities. And just whatever it is, put your best foot forward.
I can see you as a bartender too. Any bartending jobs?
I thought about that. I thought about getting into the restaurant business too for a while.
Yeah. Till you knew you have to work 7 days a week, 16 hours a day.
I'm sure I want to get into the restaurant business. So
yeah,
pivoted away from forestry, pivoted away from the restaurant business.
There you go.
Ended up being in, supply chain stuff. And, I've enjoyed it, because it's, I refer to it as a math problem. What's the lowest total cost from A to Z? But now the new world order is, sometimes you have to pay a little bit more to make your supply chain a little bit more resilient, and trying to get people's heads around that, especially with tariffs and that type of thing. It's taking on a different life of its own right now that I find pretty exciting. So I'm glad I'm still in the boat and I can still help people.
Yeah, no, it's great. That's the second group I love helping. And if you can recall that first time at Hallmark that you were given a spot on the org chart where you're responsible for a team of people. So that path to leadership, what advice would you give a first time manager?
The interactions with your folks, and, there's a propensity sometimes with first time managers to be micromanagers. It's like, I'm going to do their job for them. That's not, you gotta really force yourself to give people space, so that they can learn, make some mistakes, do the job on their own. But I think it's important too to begin to drop some strategy work into even new employees. Okay, what does that look like? How do you do longer term planning? Because you've got two issues. You got people that are trying to learn and do their job, but if you can do anything to begin to intersperse leadership concepts or strategic planning concepts early on, I think that's really, really helpful. What things do you think we should be doing that maybe we don't have the resources for? How would you define your perfect job? It's like, well, that's not on the org chart. Well, that's not the question I asked you. Map it out and why you're interested in that. So, and I just think taking that kind of personal interest in folks and doing coaching and mentoring early on is important, and encouraging them to take challenging assignments. The last thing you want to do, I tell people this all the time, whether you're in IT or whatever, you don't want to stay in that vertical forever, because that's, unless you're 100% convinced that that's where the next CEO is coming from. There's those types of questions that get asked as well. So no right or wrong answer to that, but a lot of it is just taking time with folks.
Dan, thanks so much for coming on the Corporate Couch. I think Frank Benura introduced us, and I'm grateful he did. So it's an honor to have you. You have a great career, and I love that you're still giving back and still making impact, and see how many people you can influence.
No, I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun, and took us a little while to get it on the calendar, but we got it done in 2025.
There we go. We got it. All right. Well, have a great New Year's Eve and a happy and successful 2026.
You do as well. Thanks again for having me, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Joe, this is one of the episodes where I really wish the guest and I were in a bar and recording the
a
episode.
bar.
Dan is just so good in so many different ways. We recorded on December 31st. Like why he picks that date to record, I don't know. And he had just thrown a 120 bottle bourbon / tequila mezcal party that's, invite only, which was, a lot of Kansas City legends there for sure. And I was grateful I got invited. And it was really nice. Yeah, but I love everything about Dan. He's just so good. But, his leadership, I mean, it's, how he's 2 weeks into this Hallmark job. They say, hey, would you be willing to live overseas? And he's whatever, 22, 23, 24, whatever he was. He said, oh, yeah, sure. And then 10 months later, they said, hey, would you like to move to Hong Kong? And we need your answer by tomorrow. And he had, I don't think, ever been out of the country, but I'm not sure about that. And then he had this whole international experience in the days when it was crazy with, China, Hong Kong, Sri Lanka.
Right. I mean, that's before all that was what they are now.
Yeah, it was exactly. In the days after like Nixon went over with Mao Zedong or whatever, and Henry Kissinger, not Harry Kissinger. Great leadership. I mean, he had enough kind of self-awareness, but he was still direct. He was being challenged. He's on a conference call with the Kansas City headquarter people, and it's 11 p.m. or whatever country he was at. And, they were questioning him about something and kind of, questioning why he did it this way. And because I'm here.
I'm here and you're not.
And you're not. Like he knows what the hell's going on. But, he said it in professional ways. He also got feedback by a mentor on, some people had a, bad perception of him. Instead of like complaining and being defensive about it, he said he took it and he ran with it, because he said perception is reality. Mm-hmm. And just as leadership, you don't just do stuff to keep your job. You do something transformational to earn the next one. I really love that line. A succession isn't about filling roles. It's about leaving something behind. And, he said one of his goals this year is to, mentor people in the supply chain space and young leaders. And he wants his legacy to be, did I teach them something, that survives past me, knowing me? He's a legacy thinker, and really he's one of the experts in the field of tariffs, which with the new well, I guess it's not new anymore, but with the current leadership, president and all the tariff stuff going on, it's timely to have that expertise for sure.
It's funny. A year ago, tariffs weren't anything, and now all of a sudden they're the big thing.
Yeah. So. Yeah, what did you get out of the conversation?
He had so many good stories. That whole business about just walk into a bank and say, "Hey, do you know anybody that has an injection molding machine?"
Yeah, he was in like Sri Lanka.
Yeah, with a suitcase full of Hallmark ornaments and said, "Well, we need to make these things." And the neat thing is, if you were moved over to Hong Kong, Saigon, Sri Lanka, whoever it was, you don't know anybody. And you don't know anything about, you barely know the language or anything, what else would you do? You just go out and start asking a bunch of questions till somebody.
Yeah, and to be in your 20s and have that,
There's been a couple of times, not to get a job, but a couple of times I've had projects thrown at me like that. It's like, hey, we need you to go out and find out everything you can about X or whatever the topic du jour is, And it's a feeling of hopelessness. It really is. It would kind of depend on where do you start from? How much do you already know about the subject at hand? There's been a couple of times I've been thrown out there and I didn't have any idea. And anyway, who's an expert on injection molding machines in Sri Lanka?
Right. Yeah, before you can Google that, and there's like no
it.
Right.
I don't know if they have yellow pages over there or not. Maybe they did. I don't know. So he just went to the bank and you had to figure it out.
Yellow pages, people, is things that you businesses that were sorted by category.
You used to look up in. Before there
in
was
a big
Google
book.
And Yelp.
It was a big book.
Yeah. So another story that he had that he talked about, this is close to the very end of it. He said, always answer the phone. That's what I wrote down. Always answer the phone, because you don't know who's on the other line. I guess that's before caller ID. But you don't know who's on the line. You don't know what kind of an opportunity they have to present to you.
Yeah.
I kind of look back in that and I thought almost every job that I've ever gotten, I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't working toward that thing. It just sort of came to me, or it landed at me, or somebody offered it to me, or something like that. Very, very few jobs that I've ever gotten I've had to fight and scrap for. And, if you're a listener to the Corporate Couch, maybe you're in the other camp. Maybe you've always had to fight and scrap for every job you've ever had. But there's a good chance that there's a lot of people out there that's like me that have had things put upon them, thrust upon them. But I had to at least respond to it. I had to at least say, sure. I'd had to at least be willing to pick up the phone and see what this was all about. So I think that's a good piece of advice for people.
Yeah. And I think the analogy today is, like say yes to things is the bottom line. Like, no, be open. And I think it was for people, beginning in their career, but I think it applies, to many generations, depending on what it is, because saying no is good too sometimes. But I think definitely for people in the beginning of their career, saying yes, because you don't really know what you don't know. So just say yes to things and opportunities will open. So.
I've had a lot of bosses in my life, and some good.
And I was the best one, right?
You were the best one. But I've had some very good bosses, and I've had some lousy bosses. The absolute worst boss that I ever, well, no, wait, he comes in second. There's another guy that's worse than him. The second absolute worst boss that I've ever had, he was known for that. He would always say no. If you bring him anything, his first answer would be no, and then the implication was, now, convince me otherwise. And I hated that. I absolutely hated that. And the company that he was running has since gone bankrupt and doesn't even exist anymore.
Surprise.
Surprise. But that was his philosophy. Is I'm always going to tell you. He actually said, I'm always going to tell you no to start with. And so you kind of had to start with that assumption. Hated that. Anyway.
Yeah. What are you doing this weekend, Joe? Anything fun?
Yeah, a lot of good stuff. About a year ago, I built a house and moved into it. That. But even if you have brand new construction, there is always projects to be done. There's always stuff that has to be done to your house. So last week I hired a handyman to come and work on some stuff, and I gave him a list of jobs that I wanted him to do. But he only did jobs number 1, 3, and 5.
Yeah, why is that?
It turns out he only does odd jobs.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.